Waitress mocks Leonardo DiCaprio over MAGA hat, not knowing he owns the restaurant. The evening rush at Terrazzo was in full swing. Crystal glasses clinked against marble countertops, and the warm glow of vintage chandeliers cast shadows across the faces of Los Angeles' elite. Sarah Matthews straightened her crisp black apron and surveyed her section. Table 7 needed their check, Table 4 was ready to order, and Table 12 had just been seated. She'd worked at high-end restaurants before, but Terrazzo was different. The owner was mysterious, never showing his face, managing everything through the general manager, Mr. Thompson. The staff whispered that he was some big shot from Hollywood, but nobody knew for sure. What they did know was that he paid well above industry standard and treated the staff better than any restaurant in LA. Sarah noticed the man at table 12, baseball cap pulled low, designer stubble, and a red MAGA hat partially hidden under his jacket on the empty chair beside him. Her jaw clenched. The last thing she needed tonight was another entitled conservative making her life difficult. She'd seen enough of them at her last job in Beverly Hills, demanding special treatment, leaving Bible verses instead of tips, talking down to the staff like they were beneath them. Mr. Thompson's voice echoed in her head from her first day. At Terrazzo, we serve everyone with equal respect. But as Sarah grabbed her notepad and headed toward table 12, that policy was the furthest thing from her mind. She didn't know it yet, but the next 15 minutes would change everything about her life at Terrazzo. Terrazzo wasn't just another addition to LA's crowded fine dining scene. Housed in a renovated 1920s bank building, its soaring ceilings and Art Deco details attracted Hollywood's elite and power brokers. The restaurant's success wasn't built on its architecture, or even its Michelin-starred menu. It was the staff that made it exceptional. Sarah had earned her spot on the team 6 months ago. At 32, she'd worked her way up through the restaurant industry, learning every position from dishwasher to manager. Mr. Thompson had hired her on the spot, impressed by her experience and attention to detail. "We're selective here," he'd told her. "Our owner believes in building the right team." The kitchen door swung open as Marcus, the head chef, emerged to survey his domain. His watchful eyes scanned each plate, leaving the kitchen with military precision. Despite running one of LA's most demanding kitchens, Marcus never raised his voice. He'd learned his craft in France and had nothing to prove. "Sarah, your scallops for table 7, he called out softly, placing the dish on the pass. The seared scallops glistened under the lights, perfectly caramelized. Marcus caught her eye and nodded, his way of saying the dish needed immediate delivery. As Sarah crossed the dining room, she passed Lisa, the senior server who'd taken her under her wing. At 58, Lisa had seen it all in her 30 years of service. "This place is different," she'd told Sarah during training. "We don't just serve meals here, we create memories." The restaurant's reputation for exceptional service had grown steadily over its 3 years of operation. Celebrities requested specific servers. Politicians and business leaders booked private rooms weeks in advance. Every detail was orchestrated under Mr. Thompson's careful supervision. Mr. Thompson himself was an enigma, tall, impeccably dressed, with graying temples and perfect posture. He knew every regular guest by name and remembered their preferences with uncanny accuracy. But he never disclosed anything about the owner, deflecting questions with practiced ease. The staff had theories, of course. Some believed the owner was a retired celebrity chef. Others whispered about a reclusive tech billionaire. The mystery only added to Terrazzo's allure. Sarah delivered the scallops to table 7, where a group of entertainment executives were deep in discussion. She'd learned to read tables quickly, when to be invisible, when to engage. These regulars preferred efficiency over conversation. As she turned back toward table 12, she caught snippets of conversation from her colleagues. Amy, the newest server, was struggling with a demanding party of 8. John, the veteran bartender, was crafting one of his signature cocktails for a food critic trying to maintain her anonymity. The red MAGA hat on the empty chair at table 12 drew Sarah's eye again. Its owner sat alone, studying the menu intently, His casual attire stood out among the suits and evening wear. She'd seen enough wealthy conservatives dismiss her colleagues of color, demand special treatment, and leave condescending notes with minimal tips. Mr. Thompson materialized beside her, his presence as silent as always. "Everything all right, Sarah?" His tone was neutral, but his eyes missed nothing. "Of course," she replied, squaring her shoulders. "Just heading to take an order at table 12. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Remember our standards," he said simply, before gliding away to address another matter. The ambient noise of the restaurant, clinking glasses, muted conversations, the subtle background music, seemed to fade as Sarah approached table 12. She didn't realize it yet, but this interaction would become a defining moment at Terrazzo. Sarah approached table 12, her professional smile firmly in place. The man glanced up, and she caught a glimpse of familiar features beneath his low-brimmed cap. There was something about him she couldn't quite place. "Good evening, welcome to Terrazzo. My name is Sarah." Her tone was cooler than usual, just shy of professional. "Would you like to hear about our specials?" The man's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Yes, please, and a glass of water to start." Sarah launched into her rehearsed specials description, her eyes drifting repeatedly to the MAGA hat on the empty chair. Each glance fueled her assumptions, tightened her voice. "Our chef recommends the wild-caught halibut, though perhaps you'd prefer the meat and potatoes?" The last words carried a subtle edge. The man caught her tone. He studied her face for a moment, then smiled slightly. "The halibut sounds perfect. And a glass of the Chablis." "Interesting choice," Sarah replied, unable to stop herself. "Most of our conservative guests stick to domestic wines." A few heads turned at nearby tables. The man's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "You seem to have strong opinions about your guests' political choices." Sarah felt a flash of defiance. "Just observations from experience. Those who wear certain accessories tend to be less open-minded about international offerings." Lisa, passing nearby with a tray of drinks, shot Sarah a warning glance, but Sarah was too far gone now, months of pent-up frustration with difficult customers spilling over. "I've worked in restaurants for 10 years, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. "You'd be amazed how often we can predict a guest's behavior by their political statements. The demanding attitudes, the condescension toward staff, the complaints about diversity in our team." "Sarah," Mr. Thompson's voice cut through her speech like a knife. He had materialized beside her, his normally calm demeanor tight with concern. "A word, please." But the man at table 12 raised his hand. "It's all right, James. Let her finish." His voice had changed, carrying now a quiet authority that made Sarah's stomach drop. The man removed his cap, and Sarah's world tilted sideways. The familiar features she couldn't place suddenly snapped into focus. Leonardo DiCaprio looked up at her, his expression complicated, not angry, but deeply thoughtful. "Please," he gestured to the empty chair, "sit down for a moment." Sarah's legs moved automatically. She sank into the chair, nearly knocking over the MAGA hat. Up close, she could now see what she'd missed. It was a movie prop, with a production tag still attached. "I'm here doing research," DiCaprio explained quietly, "for a role about political divisions in America, about how we stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as categories to dismiss." He picked up the hat, turning it in his hands. "I own Terrazzo because I believe in creating spaces where every person is treated with dignity, regardless of their beliefs or appearance." The dining room had grown silent. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Mr. Thompson stood perfectly still, his presence both protective and prosecutorial. Sarah's voice failed her. The magnitude of her mistake crashed over her in waves. She hadn't just violated the restaurant's standards, she'd revealed her own prejudices, her willingness to judge and dismiss someone based on a single assumption. DiCaprio leaned forward slightly. "You know what interests me most about this moment, Sarah. You were ready to lecture me about open-mindedness while demonstrating exactly the kind of closed-minded judgment you were criticizing. The next few minutes blurred together. Mr. Thompson quietly directed Sarah to the back office, while Lisa smoothly took over table 12. The short walk felt endless, passing colleagues whose expressions ranged from shock to sympathy to disappointment. The back office was small but elegant, like everything else at Terrazzo. Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs, her hands twisted in her lap. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. Mr. Thompson closed the door and took his seat behind the desk. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. "In 3 years, Sarah, this is the first time I've had to address a situation like this." "I'll clear out my locker," Sarah whispered, her voice thick. "That's not my decision to make anymore." He leaned back, studying her. "Mr. DiCaprio specifically asked to handle this situation personally. He'll be joining us shortly." Sarah's stomach clenched. The memory of her condescending tone, her smug assumptions played on repeat in her mind. She thought about her mother's words from years ago. "Judgment is a boomerang, honey. It always comes back to hit you." Outside the office, Terrazzo continued its evening service. The muted sounds of dining and conversation filtered through the door, the normal rhythm of the restaurant she'd grown to love. Had it only been 30 minutes since she'd straightened her apron and surveyed her section. A soft knock preceded DiCaprio's entrance. He'd removed his cap, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked now, not just physically, but in his entire bearing. Gone was the deliberately casual demeanor of before, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Thank you, James," he said to Mr. Thompson. "Could you give us a moment?" After Mr. Thompson left, DiCaprio took the seat across from Sarah. The MAGA hat sat on the desk between them like a piece of evidence. "Do you know why I bought this restaurant?" he asked, surprising her with the question. Sarah shook her head. "I grew up working class. My parents taught me that every job has dignity, every person deserves respect. When I made it in Hollywood, I saw how wealth and status changed people, not just those who had it, but those around them. The assumptions, the prejudices, the invisible walls we build." He picked up the hat. "This prop was for a scene we filmed today, about a conservative father trying to reconnect with his liberal daughter, about how labels and assumptions tear families apart." Sarah felt tears threatening. "I'm so sorry, I was completely out of line." "You were," he agreed quietly. "But that's not why we're having this conversation. We're having it because you're one of our best servers. James shows me the guest feedback cards. You're consistently praised for your attentiveness, your professionalism, your ability to make people feel welcome." He paused. "Until tonight." The contrast between those compliments and her recent behavior made Sarah wince. "Here's what's going to happen," DiCaprio continued. "You have a choice. You can walk away from Terrazzo. I'll ensure you get an excellent reference. Or you can stay, but with 2 conditions. Sarah looked up, hardly daring to hope. "First condition," DiCaprio said, leaning forward. "You'll work with our entire serving staff to create a new training program about unconscious bias. Your experience tonight, use it. Help others learn from it." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. The irony of her becoming a teacher of unbiased service wasn't lost on her. "Second condition," he continued. "You'll spend 1 shift a week working at our new sister restaurant in East LA. Different crowd, different assumptions, same standards of service. Think of it as a practical education in looking past labels." "I'll do it," Sarah said without hesitation. "I want to make this right." DiCaprio stood, gathering the prop hat. "One more thing, table 12 still needs their halibut served." Sarah stared at him. "You want me to go back out there, tonight?" "The moment you walk through that door, every employee will be watching. They'll either see someone who ran from their mistake or someone who faced it head-on. Your choice." Minutes later, Sarah emerged from the office. The dining room hushed briefly before resuming its usual rhythm. She felt her colleagues' eyes on her as she moved toward the kitchen. Marcus met her at the pass, the halibut plated perfectly. His usual stern expression softened slightly. "Water under the bridge," he said quietly, handing her the dish. At table 12, Sarah placed the halibut with steady hands. "Your entree, sir, and I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was unprofessional and prejudiced. I'm deeply sorry." DiCaprio nodded, then surprised her by asking, "What made you want to become a server, Sarah?" The question caught her off guard, but the answer came easily. "I love making people feel welcome, creating experiences they'll remember. At least that's what I thought I loved." She paused. "Now I realize I was only doing it for people I decided were worthy of that effort." "Self-awareness," DiCaprio said, cutting into the halibut, "is the first step toward change." He took a bite, nodded approvingly. "Tell me about this training program you're going to develop." As Sarah began to outline her initial thoughts, she noticed something had shifted. The weight of her mistake was still there, but alongside it was something new. A sense of purpose, a chance to transform embarrassment into impact. Mr. Thompson appeared briefly at her side, sliding a new table assignment onto her tray. A family celebrating a graduation. Their political leanings, backgrounds, and beliefs were unknown. For the first time, Sarah realized that's exactly how it should be. 3 months later, Sarah stood in Terrazzo's private dining room facing the entire service staff. The unconscious bias training program was launching today, incorporating real experiences from staff members and guests alike. Lisa, her once mentor now turned program co-developer, stood supportively at her side. The training manual they'd created sat on every chair, its title reading, "Beyond the First Glance, Creating True Hospitality." Mr. Thompson opened the session, but it was DiCaprio's unexpected appearance that captured everyone's attention. He slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back, dressed casually again, but without any hat this time. "3 months ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career here," Sarah began. "Instead, it became a turning point, not just for me, but for how we think about service." As she shared her story, Sarah noticed new faces in the crowd. The staff from the East LA restaurant had joined them. Their experiences, she'd learned, were the mirror image of her own. Different assumptions, same harmful impact. The MAGA hat incident had become legend at Terrazzo, but not for the reasons Sarah had initially feared. It was now known as the moment the restaurant truly began living its values. Today, that red MAGA hat sits framed in Terrazzo's staff room. Below it, a simple plaque reads, "Your greatest mistake can become your greatest lesson." But what happened at table 12 that night wasn't just about a lesson learned. It was about what some people would discover when they walked into Terrazzo next week.